Your Royal Highness, Excellencies, Dean, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be invited to this conference, and we're delighted to be platinum sponsors for this event. And may I add my congratulations to the committee for such an excellent conference. By way of introduction, yes, unfortunately, my colleague, Managing Director of Strategy and Middle East could not be here for personal reasons. So I feel I have to qualify myself a little bit. I have worked in the Middle East for 25 years between Europe and the Middle East, and as was mentioned, I lead our defense and security practice for those two regions. However, I started my career with Schlumberger, the oil exploration company, and I was based in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and lived in Hofuf, of all places, which I'm sure some of my colleagues will know. And I even know Abcake 7, which those of you who are into Trivial Pursuit is one of the most productive oil wells in the Kingdom. So that's my qualification. And now with Booz, as I said, working into the defense and security space. I'm here to talk about unleashing the region's hidden potential. So the Arab region has undergone significant changes in recent decades. These events do not affect all age groups uniformly. Instead, each generation is shaped by the socioeconomic events that it experiences most directly. As a result, the different Arab generations are increasingly distinct, each with their own perceptions, needs, and priorities. As governments and business leaders seek to craft economic reforms and make their countries more competitive, they need to tailor policies that effectively meet the varying objectives of the different Arab generations. This starts by understanding the generations themselves, their similarities and differences, and how they view the world. As a good consultant, we have slides, I'm afraid, which will take about 10 minutes, then we'll move on to Q&A. And a generational gap with my colleague, Joe Sadi. This is PowerPoint. I would have used Prezi for those younger ones among you. As part of our ongoing commitment to bring relevant foresight to the region, our Ideation Center in the Middle East has covered several topics, the past including labor to engaging youth employment. In 2012, we embarked into understanding generational characteristics, starting with the Arab digital generation, which His Highness mentioned. This year, we have extended that study into a lens on the characteristics of 3 generations comprising the Arab societies. The study is based on a primary research of 3,000 plus Arabs across 11 countries and analyzes the ebb and flow of generational ideas. The large majority of interactions were face-to-face, some by telephone, to ensure we had a good overall representation. The objective was to understand the generational divide, if any, and define any hypotheses and imperatives that may come out. The first point to make is that there is a high level of cohesiveness between generations, which is slightly counterintuitive, but we'll see some of the details in a second. So we have divided the Arab society into 3 generations. Starting on the left-hand side, we have the Arab national generation that grew up in an environment and notion of an Arab nation, very much the unity point there. Then into the Arab regional generation that are impacted by the creation of oil wealth and the rise of economic blocs in the Arab world. So quite a divide defined by a fairly clear event. Lastly, on the right-hand side, we have the Arab digital generation that we studied previously in the 2012 study. This segment of our society is impacted by the ubiquity, borderless, and open environment of the internet and the emergence of globalization. I also find this slide quite depressing, as I am on the left-hand side, physically, by age, but I hope that mentally I am more towards the right-hand side. So here, the Middle East is uniquely characterized as compared to Western societies by the importance of family ties, which is a result of bidirectional exchange of ideas and lifestyle across categories. This emanates from the fact that a majority of the digital generation live in an extended family environment. So you can see across all generations, whether it's within the GCC or non-GCC, the large majority fall into the first 2 categories, that living with immediate family, spouse and children, or within parents, within the close family. We see this as having a huge impact in generational behaviors and characteristics. This observation does not apply to other regions where we see a clear fragmentation of the family structure. This is sometimes contentious, but be it driven by a loosening of values and heritage or economic necessity, younger people moving to larger cities and conurbations in search of opportunities and jobs. The survey also looked at some of the characteristics and values. The strong family ties reflect themselves in a cohesive set of values across generations. This is probably a reflection of higher levels of hardship and reduced employment levels among the digital generation. We heard about the levels of unemployment being well above 25% in some countries. But interviews fed back very clearly the values that reign in the family environment. This is very, very positive. The survey also addressed the questions, what are the most important issues faced by generations? Many references to WASTA. As is the case with value systems, generations share a common belief around the biggest problems to be solved in their respective countries. While the WASTA has its benefits, it also generates a level of inefficiency in the system. The transfer of key brands from Western markets is yet to translate to step changes into the public health care, a major issue, especially in non-GCC countries. And censorship, delicate topic, but censorship has not yet struck a universal balance between a government's need to control versus public's need for expression and dialogue. We just discussed the consensus driven out of generational exchange of ideas at home. However, we notice striking differences as soon as we step outside the home environment. Key among these is education. The digital generation has a view that the education levels are quite poor, which is probably a result of the evolving demands of the workplace versus the skills their education brings to bear. The national generation, the generation on the left-hand side, older generation, on the other hand, seem quite satisfied with the quality of education during their era. Perhaps it's because they have more established careers and positions in society. The divide is more dramatic outside of the GCC. Globalization is causing greater demands on the skills required to succeed at the workplace. This is creating an imperative to rapidly upgrade the curricula, the way the content is presented, and the teaching methods. Simultaneously, there are several new jobs being created in new areas that requires a deep look into the breadth of the education coverage. For example, top 5 jobs today did not exist 5 years ago. More certainty and less change in job requirements for the older generation is definitely there. This is not the case for the digital generation. Greater skills in technology, wider experience expected, multidisciplinary approaches to everything we do, and no time to learn, something you might be familiar with, must be part of the given education. We notice similar differences in the work ethic across generations. While the older generation on the left-hand side of that original chart value punctuality and willingness to teach, the digital generation are inspired by a high level of flexibility and innovation. The evolving aspects of boundaries between personal and work time, workplace location becoming more fluid, directiveness versus borderless cooperation. Between generations suggests that the equation of productivity is definitely under question. This could result either in an effective multi-generational workforce that complements each other or an increase between the generations impacting productivity. Top reasons for unemployment within the digital generation is the rate of job creation is not in line with job demand. A key reason for this is the nascent small and medium enterprises environment in the region. Greatest volumes of jobs created across the globe are by SMEs, a paradigm that has not yet been fully translated to the region. Media and tech sectors have the prospects to address many of the challenges faced by digital generation around employment, especially women, which we heard from His Highness. The nature of the jobs are created, allow greater flexibility. For instance, application creation is not as complicated as previously setting up a physical store with supply chains, managing inventory, etc. We had previously predicted that the ICT sector, information, communication, and technology sector, could generate millions of new jobs across the Arab world under the right conditions. So till now, we have analyzed the macro interactions at home and society. Now we'd like to move our attention towards the more individual experiences across 4 categories of consumers: technology, advertising, media, and e-commerce. It would seem counterintuitive, but our data suggests there is no statistical difference between the technology habits of the national generation, the middle group, and the digital. In our view, this is influenced by the bidirectional exchange of ideas and behavior across generations we talked about earlier. For the national generation, this is viewed as a mechanism to stay connected with family and be entertained. And for those of you at the back who can't see this, I'm sure you can download the article from the website. While the broad consumption trends are similar across generations, the relationship to content and what the technology is used for is different. While the national generation, older generation, are much more inclined to in-person social interactions and for dialogues with the public sector, digital generation are more reliant on digital platforms and social media. This has a major implication on the pace and extent of integration of digital platforms and social media within the operations of public service broadcaster, but also the pace of development of, for example, smart government initiatives. More figures, I'm afraid. As with global trends, social media in the region is evolving from a platform of social interactions and staying connected to a marketplace. Key finding of our study is that the full society, including the older generation, national generation, are participating in the marketplace in the region. This is contrary to other regions where the older generations are not adopting these new town squares, favoring personal interactions and more basic use of technology for just email and one-to-one media, if such a thing exists. In terms of advertising, in terms of media consumption, as expected, there is a difference between television consumption of digital generation and the national generation, the older group. Digital generation are increasingly replacing TV with online and are much more responsive to it as well, much more effective to that. However, outside this shift of TV to online, generations are moving together in a similar manner to all other platforms, such as mass media advertising, and its diminishing role in creating brand awareness or driving purchasing decisions. Here we have a split of advertising spend. You can see 62% for mass media is a high percentage compared to the rest of the developed world. This has huge implications for large commercial corporations and their go-to-market strategies, but also for governments in defining how best to raise awareness of new developments, regulations, benefits, obligations, etc. A far-reaching impact on how to interact with consumers and citizens for all institutions. Again, greater impact on the digital generation, an opportunity to correct this and refocus resources, budget and effort to better target this. As low as doing one transaction alone, the bar is significantly lower for penetration of e-commerce in the region than the average in developed markets, which are as much as double of what you see here. This is a result of weak ecosystems and the issues around regulation, structural enablers, including connectivity. This figure is close to double in the rest of the world, and the difference in value spent is even greater. The threshold here is one transaction, so you can see how those figures would be affected. There is a clear call to action for policymakers, public sector players, and marketeers to address the structural challenges in the region around diversity and security raised by the consumers. Many of the issues cited by consumers can potentially be resolved by a close proximity to social aspects. You can see that these reasons are well known and have been addressed in other regions, in other parts of the world, in more developed economies. The workforce needs new skills, some imperatives. The workforce needs new skills as demand in the labor market evolve rapidly. Education curricula must catch up and even be ahead of existing demand. Mixed workforces need all-encompassing policies across generations to achieve higher productivity and lower attrition. Targeting better marketing strategies and dollars to specific generational needs is absolutely imperative. And lastly, the ecosystem from the infrastructure to connectivity, legislation needs reviewing to capitalize on e-commerce growth. This has both financial as well as societal impact. And to conclude, our survey shows that demands from our generations is outstripping the existing private and public sector ecosystems in many areas, stressing the call for action. In our opinion, on the one hand, the public sector needs to drive a set of policies addressing the macro issues, whilst the private sector has the opportunity to create impact and formulating the right set of micro-level strategies. These policies and strategies need to translate into tangible outcomes, addressing several important areas, including education, employment, the workplace, electronic and mobile smart governments, public service, broadcasting, advertising, e-commerce. We believe that executing these imperatives will help unleash the region's hidden potential. Thank you. I will take questions.
Actually, you mentioned about the three types of generation. I believe that classification is in general, not in deep. If you look to different separate categories, you have different society and different characteristics for every country. So if you look what's happened in Tunisia or even in Syria or even in Egypt, you see that different. Like Egypt come in the middle. Do you agree about that? So and how we can fill that gap between these three generations?
Might not have come across in the presentation, in the details of the survey, but very clearly the results were very different from between the GCC and the non-GCC countries. General societal behaviors and characteristics were fairly similar, which is based on values, integrity, etc. However, the more commercial and what we call the micro level points were quite different, which I think addresses the question made. In terms of education, yes, there is a lot of material curriculum available in either prestigious institutions like this or online, as you say. However, for a nation, it is pretty important we see that education is very much targeted to that society, especially when you have such an agenda of change that needs to come through. So it needs to be a combination of both those things. But also the more important point perhaps is the whole legislation that needs to be in place in order to enable and unleash that potential and bring people to use the education in that particular nation or in the region itself.
Hello, my question is about e-commerce. I just wanted to understand, with the population explosion that's happening in the Middle East, every country seems to have over 50% of its youth under the age of 30. Can you please talk a bit about technology and what you believe if e-commerce is going to explode in the Middle East? Because I've been in Dubai and I've met many Jordanians, and they're telling me that it's going to be quite a strong movement in that area. I just wanted your advice, really.
Very good. So on e-commerce, very huge potential of growth for that we all know for obvious reasons. There are two key factors there. One is infrastructure factors, the other one are behavioral. So the behavioral we see as being quite homogeneous across the regions. No matter what country, generally people have some of the reservations that you saw up front. People don't trust the internet, they don't know what to buy, they want to feel products, a fairly, if I dare say in front of this audience, fairly old-fashioned ways of looking at using e-commerce. That is the behavioral side. On the infrastructure side, there is definitely a big difference between GCC and non-GCC countries. Countries that have invested in connectivity, etc., even legislation that have put in place strong legislation in order to allow and invite the wider use of internet, then e-commerce is taking off. And we saw some figures here where in those countries it is much more prominent. So there is those two characteristics have to be addressed. One is the behavioral, making sure society trusts this new way of doing business. And we're not just talking about B2C, but also B2B, business to business, even customer to government, G2C. A huge opportunity, which is slowly happening, but much more needs to happen. And as well as basic connectivity, infrastructure, bandwidth, all the basics, the last mile problem that we all hear about, getting to people's homes. Those are the key factors that will unleash that. My personal view is that this is inevitable. It's just a matter of when.
In terms of using internet use, you mentioned a gap between generations. Do you think that considering the different Arab Springs, mainly in Egypt, the more Arab digital generation widens, the more the revolutionary spirit will broaden, making it more difficult for governments to keep the censorship that your survey was detected as the biggest problem? Is that too long? Sorry.
Thank you. A very, very pertinent question. I'll confess I don't feel qualified to answer that question, but I'll have a go anyway. I would suggest that, again, it is the balance between we talked about censorship. You know, I think governments are still struggling in certain cases to get the balance right between control and openness. Open access, invitation to greater freedom in society versus control. And I think that balance is a very delicate one, which it is not my area, so I will not comment further. How is that used? Then that is a much bigger topic, again, beyond this conference. But it is, my personal view is that it needs to happen at the government level. Legislation is absolutely fundamental to get the balance right between doing what is right and freedom.
My question was about more the consulting world as a general. Do you see trends in how consulting is changing in the Middle East? For example, in the past, we were seeing like consultants coming for copy-pasting solutions from Europe or the US. I do feel that now it's more tailored. There are inherent problems and inherent solutions that you need to create in consulting for the Middle East. Can you maybe elaborate on that topic?
Sure. Well, we see it very much in our business, in fact. The days of copying what is happening in Europe or the US, I think, are long gone. And the main reason being, there are many, but one of the key reasons is that the skills level and expertise of the region are growing rapidly, so there's less dependency on that. But perhaps more importantly, the shaping of solutions needs to be tailored to the region. The majority of businesses in the West are looking at efficiency, cost cutting, and very, very short term, thinking very, very, quarter by quarter, if that. The agenda generally in the region is much more longer term. It's about growth and building capability. So very different agendas. So those days are gone. It is very, very regional focused, I would suggest.